It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Lyubov Lytvyn. I am a PhD candidate at McMaster University, and I'm also the client care director at MAGICapp ecosystem. Today, I'm going to be talking about the authoring and publishing platform that MAGICapp ecosystem has developed called MAGICapp. Okay, fantastic. As I mentioned, it's going to be a bit of a workshop, more of a tutorial on using MAGICapp with a focus on living evidence and how we can create living clinical practice guidelines. So declarations of interest, I am the client care director for MAGICapp ecosystem, which means I lead the education and support side of MAGICapp, and I also collaborate with Magic for the last several years, doing a bunch of different research projects. I'm also a member of the grade working group, and I have no other academic or financial conflicts to disclose. So for the agenda today, I'm going to just go over the evidence ecosystem and MAGICapp in general. Then I'm going to cover living guidelines as an overview. I think some of you have seen some presentations already by some people from our team and other collaborators who may have mentioned some of the guidelines we'll talk about today. And then I'm going to show you an example living guideline, which is a WHO, BMJ, and MAGIC collaboration, which is a therapeutics for COVID-19 guideline. Then I'm going to go over MAGICapp for authoring and living guidelines. And I may attempt to do a group exercise on updating an evidence profile and recommendation in MAGICapp. So this is a framework called the Digital and Trustworthy Evidence Ecosystem. This is a slight modification to take into consideration COVID-19 and a living systematic review and network meta-analysis. But essentially, the idea is to have these sort of interlocking gears as the foundation, including global standards, a coordinated process, tools and platforms, culture for sharing and innovation, digitally structured data, common methods, and orchestration and support. And the concept is that you have all of these steps kind of going in a cycle. So the data feeds into additional innovation. And starting with, let's say, potentially practice-changing evidence on the left-hand side, if you have evidence that gets published, it gets incorporated into a living systematic review and network meta-analysis with a living evidence summary. And then there's going to be a trustworthy and living guidance ready for submission and review, then dissemination, guidance to policymakers, clinicians, and patients globally ready for reuse and adaptation, and then implementation, guidance, and decision support. And this includes things like personalized decision support in electronic health records, pathways, registries, and local protocols. And then an evaluation and practice piece with quality improvement initiatives, population-based data in electronic health records, dynamic registries, and additional studies, and trying to kind of go in that cycle so that people are not working so much in silos. Sorry, I'm just seeing some comments. Okay. That's not specifically for me. Okay, great. So when it comes to MAGICapp, so app is not actually an app in the way that we have, Apple apps and things like that, because this was developed back in 2012 before that became popular. It actually is just an acronym for Authoring and Publication Platform, so APP. And it's based on standards for trustworthy guidelines and grade methods. And it's a way to create clinical practice guidelines, evidence summaries, and decision aids in this sort of digitally structured way. So the idea is to have this new evidence and be able to dynamically update it because you have this sort of core foundation of digitally structured data. And working in this database, you can create multi-layered formats for all of your devices. You can create decision aids, you can do adaptation work, and then you can also integrate it into electronic medical records. Sorry, my slides are a little slow. Okay, and I just want to highlight that this is sort of the brainchild of Dr. Lynn Brandt, who's based in Norway and is the Chief Technology Officer of MAGICapp. So living guidelines. Some key definitions. Living recommendations are individual recommendation that's kept current by optimizing guideline updating process that accounts for potentially consequential evidence as soon or shortly after it becomes available. This is a definition proposed in a recent publication in Annals of Internal Medicine, a framework for living evidence guidelines. And a living guideline itself is a guideline that includes one or more of such living recommendations that's, again, kept current with an optimized guideline updating process that accounts for potentially consequential evidence as soon as shortly after it becomes available. This was a recent publication back in December 2021 with some folks who are at the forefront of innovating living evidence methods. And this is a really striking demonstration of just how overwhelming the amount of new data is. And there's a kind of person-shaped evidence pile that just keeps growing and growing, and people are adding more and more data, and healthcare providers are just trying to interpret it. And it was an article that was sort of emphasizing that with COVID-19 in particular, there isn't really a reason to not kind of move towards this sort of way of updating evidence and updating guidance. However, of course, it's very challenging for certain topics, so it's not feasible to do in all cases. But COVID-19 has really emphasized the need for this sort of living and continuously updating model. So this is just a diagram of one of the early guidelines that was made into a living guideline, pre-COVID actually. This is the Australian Stroke Foundation guideline. And as you can see, these blue little dots are some individual primary studies. And then the guideline publication is the green dot. So it took this many individual trials to finally create this, this guideline. And they decided to move to a living guideline model. So as you can see, there's a much shorter time span in between additional studies being published and then a new publication happening. So all the subsequent red little dots are additional guideline publications that are living guidelines. And this is another way to kind of demonstrate in a graph sort of the model of a conventional intermittently updated guideline, where you have your guideline development steps. And then once you publish it, there's an implementation step. But then a lot of times over time, you have outdated recommendations, you have change in policies, and then you might have additional trials or new products on the market. And then they may not be updated fast enough in order to incorporate that evidence. So kind of this first part was sort of illustrating the classic guideline publication model. And then the second side is demonstrating this continuous publication model. So this living evidence concept. So that's going to be more like this spike at the very beginning. And then after you have your publication, you have more of a wave where you incorporate change in policy and then new products on the market. And again, following this kind of evidence ecosystem model where you have continuous updating. So some key features for developing living guidelines is that you have to accommodate changing authors and reviewers. One of the key issues that was highlighted from authors who are working on living evidence is that people get very tired. So of course, it's impractical for folks to be working on living guidelines indefinitely. There's definitely going to be a rotation of people who are working on the project, and living guidelines have to accommodate for that. There's of course challenges with things like publishing and authorship. A lot of journals don't really, they're not really able to give new DOIs, so that people are not really recognized the same way that a lot of academia values additional publications. So at the moment, it's more feasible and more valuable to publish many individual studies than it is to kind of work on a living study like this. Another thing that's important would be collaborative editing. That's not essential to have in a platform per se, but kind of a Google Docs model has been something that a lot of people are moving towards. And that's a really great way to incorporate multiple people's feedback at the same time and be able to kind of have a two-sided conversation, which is better than the sort of, one document at a time, people having email threads, people commenting on different versions of the document and not being able to sort of follow through with that, which is particularly important when you have tight timelines and a lot of people working on something. A third important element is to be able to update the evidence and recommendation dynamically, so one at a time essentially, or just be able to update it in piecemeal without having to revamp the entire guideline itself. A fourth element is access to version history and to be able to report changes between versions, both for individual recommendations and also potentially for the whole guideline. And then a fifth is to disseminate continuously updated guideline via different publication options. So classically, we have your journal articles, and that's a lot of the times how guidelines are currently being published, but a lot of people are exploring different ways of publishing guidelines through, for example, online frameworks, perhaps some more integrated kind of publishing avenues like apps and different things that incorporate digitally structured content and try to make it accessible for users at the point of care. So an example guideline that's a living guideline is the WHO, BMJ, and MAGIC collaboration for the Therapeutics for COVID-19 guideline. And this is just an overview of how it was done. So starting with potentially practice-changing research, there is a living network meta-analysis team, and Dr. Romina Brigno-Della-Pearson is going to be presenting on that, I think, later this morning. And you have your guideline panel, which is made up of methodologists, physicians, ethicists, public health practitioners, and patients. And they come up with living recommendations. So recommendations for and against certain therapies. And this is a collaborative effort that is jointly disseminated, so developed and disseminated by the World Health Organization, the BMJ, and MAGICapp. This is what the publication looks like in the BMJ. And then this is what it looks like on the WHO website, who have their own PDF. The BMJ does produce this really beautiful infographic collaboratively with MAGIC, and then we use that across our platforms. And this is what it looks like in MAGICapp. So there's a publication date there for September, which was the last update. So some notes about the example that I'm going to show you is this is an example guideline that's simplified, and it's just an overview for tutorial purposes. I wanted to emphasize that the content is multi-layered in MAGICapp, so users can drill down for more info as provided by authors, depending on how much information the authors provide. MAGICapp is highly customizable, so guideline developers use the features or not depending on their needs, and all published guidelines in MAGICapp are available to the public. And data sharing and adaptation of guidelines is encouraged with permission. We did have some really great collaboration between organizations. So for example, the Australian COVID-19 guidelines, they would share their evidence profiles with the NICE COVID-19 guidelines, as well as the Danish COVID-19 guidelines. And then those organizations would develop their own recommendations, but it did definitely save them some time to share the evidence profiles. So this is just an overview of what the MAGICapp version of the therapeutics guideline looks like. So there's an organization logo there for the WHO, the organization title, the version and the date of publication, the different sections. This is the top layer. I'll kind of explain what the top layer is by showing you the next slide, which is what we consider additional layers. This is a link to the section. So that means you can actually put this content in different places. A lot of times what organizations ended up doing is having their own website, which had not just the guideline, but had kind of like education materials, like clinical pathways and all sorts of relevant sort of contextual information and local tools. And then they would link to the content within MAGICapp so that they can sort of use what was relevant for them. There's also a link to the content for specific individual boxes here, the top layers or the recommendations, and also their version history. There's a subscriber option, which gives you emails and updates if you subscribe to a particular guideline, so you're up to date if something is a living guideline that gets updated. There's a PDF download button, and then there's also a general information button. So when it comes to guideline text sections, we decided to have text-only sections that are hidden in the second layer, but there's also another option where you can show the first few lines of text. So this is just to kind of keep things neat. So for example, when you have abbreviations, you don't have to scroll through it. This is something that's different from your traditional PDF guidelines, because a lot of times a PDF is hundreds of pages, and depending on how much additional content there is, it's just a lot of scrolling. So this is why the multi-layered content is very useful, and why it comes in handy in a digital format, because you don't necessarily have to see everything all at the same time. You can still pull up the PDF, which is automatically generated through MAGICapp. And then you can also customize it if you have a design team or something like that to like fit your journal requirements. But the content in MAGICapp is very interactive, and people can kind of just choose what they decide to look at. So this is an example of a recommendation. This is the most recent recommendation for the treatment of patients with non-severe COVID-19 at the highest risk of hospitalization, and the recommendation, the conditional recommendation for remdesivir. So this is the recommendation itself, and then below it are the remarks. These are both things that are pretty customizable. We have some guidance for how we would recommend people to author things, but it's not necessarily required. And then below you see these different tabs, and these different tabs are the ones that contain additional information underlying the recommendation. So research evidence, evidence to decision framework, justification, practical information, and decision aids. The evidence profiles, that's under the research evidence. So here's an example of one of them. You have dichotomous, continuous, and narrative outcome options. You can link as many Picots as you want to. So in this particular case, there's 3 different Picots that are linked to the recommendation. And then there's a summary of findings view, which is this one. Then there's a graphical view and a narrative summary, which I will show in the next 2 slides. But just to quickly go through the summary of findings table, I think folks are usually pretty familiar with the framework. You have your outcome, and then you may include a time frame, or maybe in this case, like a risk assessment, or like a risk detail in terms of what kind of risk is the baseline risk for the patients for that outcome in particular. Then study results and measurements. So your effect estimate and how many participants and how many studies. Absolute effect estimates, so the no remdesivir and remdesivir per 1,000 people with the difference between the two. Certainty of the evidence, so that's your grade rating of certainty, and the reasons for downgrading if there are any, and then also a plain language summary. Next, we have just a different way of showing the effects. So in addition to showing the outcomes, as I demonstrated previously, you can show the absolute effects with this graphical view. This is something that we developed with the BMJ because people really liked the way that the infographics were done. So now we've kind of included a way to present this also for all users. You just have to select it when you create your evidence profile, but it kind of automatically generates the sort of figure for you. You can also include a summary of the evidence. So in this particular case, there's the summary findings table, the graphical representation, and the summary, but you don't necessarily have to do all of those things. And in some cases, you may not have very clear evidence profiles, and you may only actually have a summary of the evidence. And this is an option for you to just kind of have a narrative summary, but still link it to the recommendation. Then we have the evidence to decision framework. There's an option for a 4-factor framework or a 7-factor framework. In the therapeutics guidelines, we opted for the 4-factor framework, although in the resources and other considerations tab, we do include other elements as well. So in this particular case, there's an acceptability and feasibility, which are kind of just under resources and other considerations, rather having their own tabs. And there's a summary, there's an option for summary text only, or to have the full ETD. So that's with the intervention judgments and research evidence and additional considerations in addition to the summary text. Then we have a justification tab. In some guidelines, this is the rationale tab. It depends if you kind of customize what the label name is. And this is where people integrate the key information factors, so the ETD factors, to reach the decision. And you write like a narrative summary of rationale for the decisions. In this particular case, the therapeutics guideline also has content on alternative options and then also applicability. Then we have the practical information tab, and this is additional information to make the recommendation actionable. So things like dosing information, contraindications, subgroups, that kind of thing. And then in this particular case, they also link to some external resources. So there's some hyperlinks here to some little leaflets that are made for by like the pharmacists that are kind of like useful for clinical use and also for patients. just some important information that would be kind of too much to cover here, but is useful to sort of have on hand. And then you can include images, tables, etc. So there's not really a limitation of what you add here, anything that the guideline developers think would be useful. Then we have the decision aids. So these are auto-generated from the absolute effects from evidence profiles. You can turn them off if you want to. So some users, they don't particularly want to have the decision aids automatically generated, but they are customizable. So for example, if you don't want to include all of the different outcomes, if you want to prioritize kind of your most important outcomes so that you don't have, an overwhelming decision aid with like 20 outcomes, but you still want to include that data, for example. And then you can also rename the outcomes into plain language. So if you have very technical outcome terms, you can rename them because the idea is that they're supposed to be used with patients and caregivers. You can also print a PDF of the information for patient caregivers as well. This is what one of the evidence profiles look like. They're supposed to be a conversational decision aid. So they start off by prompting users with the question, what aspect of your treatment would you like to discuss next? And that there's the outcome options here, and then you can click them, and then you can see kind of what the data is. And then for dichotomous outcomes, you can also drill down and you can see sort of the iconograph here with the little people representing 1,000 people like you. And then for continuous outcomes, it's a bar graph representing the differences between the two, the treatment and the usual care. For the recommendation, the two other things I wanted to highlight is that you can look at the history of the recommendation, and then you can also link to the recommendation. So I showed you earlier that you can link to specific sections, but you can also link to specific recommendations. In this case, this permalink will always take you to the most recent published version, which is very useful for continuously updating content. You don't need to worry about making sure that you fixed all of your new links. And that your links are not going to go dead. This link will always kind of show you whatever you created. And then this is a link for the specific version of the recommendation. So that's if for any reason you want to link to just that one version, but it will not work if you ever update your guideline. This is the recommendation version history. You can view the previous versions with the dates, and then you can also add a comment about the changes between versions. In this case, there isn't a comment, but there would be one in that sort of blank space that you see below the version number. So there's a space where you can say, between version 10.0 and 11.0, XYZ changed or something like that. There is a little tag that you can include for recommendations. You can set a status label. In this particular case, version 10 is when the recommendation was first made, so it was tagged with new, but then subsequent versions didn't have the same tag. And I just wanted to pull up what it would look like. So if you would click this view button here, then it pulls up the original recommendation that was originally published in March. And then you can see what the content was at that time. So when it comes to MAGICapp authoring and living guidelines, so I just wanted to show a basic overview. I realize this is a lot for almost 200 people, but hopefully if people are interested, you can sort of review this when you go back to it. I'm hoping that we can at least try to have some people try it out later today in the last half hour or so. But if not, I can at least demonstrate what this would be if you were a new user and you were to do this on your own. So creating an account is pretty straightforward. There's a little button there that's create an account. You can either use your email or you can create an account through an existing login. We have login options for Cochrane, WHO, and Google. And then to create a new guideline, also pretty straightforward. There's just a button. You have to add some information like a title, a short title, the editor, and then the owner. If you are a new user and you're not part of an organization, you only have this, the owner can only be personal, but if you're part of an organization and you're creating a guideline on behalf of them, then you'll have additional drop-down options. And then you can also set your language. We have 14 different language options. And then you can include a description. So things like, conflict of interest management or whatever you think is relevant. This is just an overview of the authoring. So when you first pull up you're authoring. So in this case, on the left-hand side, you have Magic Evidence Ecosystem. That's the owner, that's the logo there. And I just made a draft for the tutorial for today. You can add new sections. You can add as many sections as you want. You can add references, Picots, and then the default view is to view or add the main guideline content and recommendations. So this is where all the text and all the recommendations go. And I will say we call them recommendations, but they're actually like any kind of like top layer content. You can add text anywhere where you see a little pencil. So there's a bunch of pieces of content that are editable. And then there's an add recommendations button. So again, for the top layer content, and I'll show you what that looks like on 2 slides from now. And then there's a little bell icon, that's the activity log, which I'll show you in a subsequent slide. And then there's a bunch of settings options, which I'm not going to delve into too much today. So when it comes to text, it's fairly standard word processing options. I didn't explain what all of the different options are, but I just kind of wanted to highlight that the way that you add citations is just by clicking this little library book icon. And essentially the way that the reference management works in MAGICapp is that it creates a sort of database of references in the way that you have EndNote, and then you kind of do a cite while you write sort of thing. And then there's also a track changes feature. So similarly to how you would have in word processing, you can add or delete content and it will color code and show who it was. And then you can also create comments and things. You can add tables, images, change font, highlight things, numbers and bullet points, just pretty standard word processing. This is what I mean by when I said that there's multiple types of recommendations that you would include. So anything that's a top layer content is what we call a recommendation. So anything that ends up being in this box and not something that's text or that's hidden in like a section. So you can include grade types or non-grade types. So we have your standard weak and strong recommendations for and against, and good practice statements. And then other types are things like info boxes, consensus recommendations, implications for research, only research settings, which came in handy during COVID-19. That's something that we added. These are things that are generally added when a lot of users want them. So again, these are kind of the things that are customizable and sort of ever changing in the platform based on what users require. When it comes to authoring evidence profiles, there's a couple ways to do it. You can either do it manually, you can import it from a Revamp file, you can import it from a MAGIC-zip file. So that's what I mentioned earlier, how people were sharing evidence profiles when they were creating guidelines in MAGICapp. So that's a super fast way to do it. And then you can also import Picots through a GDT grade profile. Although we don't have like full capacity to copy all the content, there's some differences between them. And then there's, again, like similar options that you had for recommendations. You can link to evidence profiles. You can see the history of evidence profiles, and then you can also remove them. So when you add a Picot, you follow the population intervention comparator format, which can be sometimes limiting when it comes to things like public health recommendations. But we kind of are, it's very useful for more so clinical questions, but there's like ways that people use it for public health questions as well. Then you can add outcomes, and this is just an example. If I were to select a dichotomous outcome, and let's say that this was all-cause mortality, then I have a whole bunch of different parts that I can fill out. Whether or not I want to, that's fine. If you don't add content, the users just don't see that that's an option. So for example, if you don't add clinical importance, it's not like there's a blank for clinical importance, it just doesn't show up at all. But these are some things that people found useful, so we added them. We also include mesh tags, and this is for incorporation into electronic health records. Although not a lot of groups are kind of using that feature, it's something that MAGICapp was initially developed to use, sort of really taking advantage of digitized content. But of course, there's a lot of regulations related to electronic health records and kind of the limitations in being able to plug actual recommendations into electronic health records. And then you have your effect estimates. So in all of these cases, you can add more and more content if you want to. And this is something that your users can see. Oh, sorry, not too fast there. So for example, you can add your reference for the systematic review that you used. You can also add the data that came from the systematic review in terms of like the participants in the studies, or you can even add like essentially your table 1 data. And then you add your effect estimate, your baseline risk, and then you calculate the absolute effect estimate. You can add additional references if something is relevant and make comments. Then you do your grade assessment, and there's a handy little template that we have here as well, where you can sort of select some options, and that kind of gives you some template text. So essentially the most common reasons that people would grade down for things, you can select the reason, and then you can select the options, and that puts in the comment for you automatically. Then we have the plain language summary. So below we have the plain language summary guidance. That's from Grade. Again, everything is created using Grade methods. And then we have the graphical direction of benefits. So you can opt whether or not to select that. And then you add your summary text. You can choose the standard text. So it does actually automatically generate some text for you that you can decide to use or not. And one of the other things I wanted to mention is how collaboration works in MAGICapp. So in the guideline settings, there's a permissions option, and you can essentially add users to your guideline. And there's several different kinds of levels of permissions that they can have. They can either be an administrator, which means they can do absolutely everything. They can add or remove users. They can publish the content and anything related to authoring. And then they can be authors, which means they can just author the content, but they can't publish things, and they can't like change administrative level things. They can also be reviewers, and that's if you want people to be able to look at the content and comment on it, but not be able to actually edit anything. And then viewers, and that's if you want people to look at the content and comment on it, but then not content that's currently drafted. So only content that's already been published. This is the activity log. So here's just an example. Everything that you do in MAGICapp is automatically saved. So you don't need to necessarily save things as you keep going. Everything is automatically logged. And the way that it's logged is that there's a timestamp, there's the user, there's the action that they had, and then you can also view the details of that action. And then you can also add comments, you can flag things. There's a bunch of different things that kind of facilitate collaboration and being able to sort of talk to each other and monitor what other users are doing in your guideline. On the right-hand side, there's also some kind of summary features that are useful for administrators as well. So this also tracks if there's any comments in the text and if there's any unresolved feedback. So that's if someone commented on the recommendation and you haven't resolved the comments, or you haven't deleted them or fixed them. The reference management, there's a couple different ways to add references. So the easiest one is to upload a reference library RIS file. So for example, from EndNote. You can also individually add references with a PubMed ID, which is pretty fast. You can add references manually, which is definitely the most time-consuming option, but feasible, particularly if you have something that isn't published or something that's an unusual type of citation. And then you can also upload references and the data from Revamp files. There's a lot of integration in MAGICapp with Revamp, which I will show you in the exercise example. So publishing, so the way that publishing works is pretty fast. So unlike a journal, it actually only really takes you a couple minutes. This is also where the version history is. So when you select the publishing version history and subscription option, you have the permalink to the always latest version of the whole guideline itself. You have previous versions of the guideline, and then you can view them. You can also create copies of them, or like a link to the copies of that particular version, if that's interesting for whatever reason. And then you can, again, as previously with the individual recommendations, you can also add comments to demonstrate what's changed between different versions. And that's an author sort of option to use. And you can decide whether or not you're going to make that version public. So in this particular case, everything that is created has been public subsequently from one of the earliest versions. But for example, if you're still working on your guideline and you only want it to be available internally, then you don't make it public. So you don't check off that little tick box. When you're ready to publish a new version, there's just a couple things that you need to fill out. So you select whether or not there's going to be public access, if it's going to be a major or a minor publication, any comment if you want to have, and the publishing date, and then the last evidence search, and then you just publish the new version. For small guidelines, it only takes a few minutes. For larger guidelines, it can definitely take some time. Once you get up to like, hundreds of recommendations and hundreds of references, it can take more than an hour to publish. Some additional features that I thought would be important to highlight would be that Picots and recommendations can be shared across guidelines. So in the options, there's a zip file that you can create for recommendations and for evidence profiles, and then you can share that between users. And then there's also, I wanted to mention, there's 14 languages, which are for the users themselves and also for the guidelines. So that means that all of the different, all of the different recommendation labels and all of the content labels are translated. So that means you can use your own language. And that's it for the tutorial. Any questions? I don't know how flexible it is for like a panel to ask questions, but I guess I was interested in what are some elements related to updating or living recommendations that folks would be interested in seeing, because I can definitely sort of show you in real time some additional features and additional options.
Yes, Ms. Lyubov, there is a question in the Q&A. Can you open the Q&A, please?
I only see no open questions. And then in terms of the chat, I don't see.
Yeah, you can find the Q&A down.
Okay, I do see the Q&A, but it doesn't, there's no content there. It says no open questions, for me at least.
Okay, I'm gonna read it for you.
Okay.
Let me see, there's like question here. This Dr. Abdulrahim said, the form of object-oriented teaching is one of the best way of teaching, but need much work in preparing the material. Do you agree?
Sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
Okay, he said, the form of object-oriented teaching is one of the best way of teaching, but need much work in preparing the material. Do you agree?
Sorry, object-oriented teaching?
Yes.
I'm not sure if I understand the question. I'm not familiar with object-oriented teaching.
Okay, maybe that's a question for the speaker. Don't worry.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. His hint said, you can please provide us with examples as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, maybe she think, yeah, if you have any examples for the presentation that.
Yes. Okay. Yes. Okay. I wanted to show folks the way that you would update content in MAGICapp in real time. I was just a bit nervous in terms of like running into some tech issues, but hopefully it should be okay. So if you just give me a second and I'll share a screen. Professor Lubna has a question, but it's in Arabic. Is it for me?
Again, please.
Sorry, I just noticed that Professor Lubna El Ansari has a question, but it's in Arabic. So I was wondering if it's a question for me or for.
This is Prof. Lubna. Just make suggestion. If there is, she asked from the audience if they write the questions in the chat. If anyone have a questions for Lyubov, please write it on chat or on the Q&A, and we'll answer it for her.
Okay, so can you see my screen?
Yes, it's okay. Clear.
Okay, great. Okay. So I made a little guideline for the tutorial. And so this is just obviously not real data. I didn't want to play around with some fake data, even if it was for a known topic. So the question here is, let's say we have condition X and it's a treatment called treatment A compared to standard of care. So in this particular case, I've actually updated the recommendation, but I wanted to create a new recommendation and kind of show you the process of how you would do that. So if I were to create a new guideline, I would just select my name. I'll just make it personal. I don't want to add a description, but just to quickly add something here. So this is how the app looks like. So you can add different sections. If you want to make a subsection, you just drag them into each other and you can create as many subsections and sections as you'd like. So for example, this might be introduction, this might be methods, and then this is our, recommendations for condition X, for example. And then let's say we're ready to kind of have a draft recommendation. We don't have any data yet, but this is what the content looks like. And one thing I realized I didn't have in the slides is this feedback option. So this is what I mentioned that you can do. You can comment on if you have permission, either as a reviewer or a viewer, and of course, as an author or an administrator. So you can just make comments here for any of the recommendations, and then you can also classify them if you're an administrator, if they're unresolved, in progress, or resolved. And then any comments that are there, you can also reply to them. And then the person that made the comment is going to get an alert saying that someone replied to you. So this is a way that you can have sort of like internal collaboration. For example, if you have a peer review process, or even as you're drafting the content in the first place, this is a way that you can sort of have interaction between your guideline authors. Another thing I wanted to mention that I didn't have in the example guideline is there's some additional tabs that we recently added. So some users were requesting additional tabs for implementation, evaluation, research needs, and adaptation. And again, if you don't have the content in here, then it just doesn't show up. So it's not that your users feel like they're missing anything. It's just that there's some additional features if you want to make use of them. So if I want to add a Picot, let's say I have a Picot from a Revamp file. So I'm going to add a new Revamp file. And this is my Revamp file. It has a treatment A versus usual care with 2 outcomes, all-cause mortality and self-reported clinical recovery. So I create my Picot. And it pulls the data. So I wanted to show you what I meant earlier by the integration. So if you look at AdEvidence, it actually shows you kind of like the table 1 data here. And again, this is because I'm using Revamp files. There's a lot of integration between them. So then you actually have your individual study data here without having to add it to a table in another section, for example. That's automatically pulled. And then you can also set, if it's a randomized controlled trial, if you want to add some follow-up data, because that's not something I had in the Revamp file originally. And then if you want to make any comments, I don't know, any descriptions about the outcome or the evidence or anything like that. And then there's no certainty, of course, because it's a Revamp file, so they wouldn't have that content. But in this particular case, for the all-cause mortality outcome, let's say that there's no serious risk of bias, no serious inconsistency, no serious indirectness, but there is some serious imprecision because we have kind of wide confidence intervals. And then I can select the wide confidence intervals comment. So that automatically gets imported for me. There's no publication bias issues. And then it does automatically generate the rating and then also the reason for me. So I just save that content. Then moving on to the plain language summary. In this particular case, all-cause mortality is an important outcome, but there is no important difference. So I will select this as my direction of benefit, and then highlighted in pink is what the suggestion is for the plain text summary is. So I can select that if I want to. So in this case, there is no important benefit or null effect. So I can say treatment A probably has little or no difference on all-cause mortality. I needed a little bit of editing with the text, but basically it's kind of automatically generated for me. And then for self-reported clinical recovery, let's say in this particular case, it is our randomized controlled trial, but because it's self-reported, we have some risk of bias because of blinding of participants and personnel. And let's say there's no inconsistency, no indirectness, but there is some serious imprecision, and there's no publication bias, no reason for updating. And it does automatically pull like one reason at a time, so you do have to edit it slightly. So here I will say, due to serious risk bias and serious imprecision. And wide confidence intervals again is my reason. And again, plain language summary. In this case, it's highlighted as low. It is an important outcome, but there is no difference. So I will again generate the text and save that. And that is my evidence profile. And then if I want to link it to the recommendation, I pull this up and then I will see all of the evidence profiles that I have created. In this case, it's just the one. So now I have this evidence profile here and these two outcomes. And then I can also see the graphical view if I want to. And then I can create my recommendation. So let's say that in this particular case, there's going to be a conditional or weak recommendation against, because it seems like there may be some risk of mortality. There's maybe a little bit of benefit in self-reported clinical recovery, but not enough to consider it a strong recommendation. And it seems like there may be some harm and there isn't very strong evidence. So I will say, we suggest against treatment A for condition X. And then for the evidence to decision, let's say that we want to have, I do have all the text actually drafted. I'm just going to copy and paste it from the previous guideline I made just to keep interest of time. I noticed there's some Q&As here. I'm just going to look at them real quick. To what extent the guidelines take differences in race, lifestyle differences in multinational race communities? That's a great question. I think it really depends on which guideline we're working with. So different organizations may kind of prioritize different social factors when they make their recommendation, but that's something that they may include in maybe the feasibility or acceptability section, if it would be relevant. Another question is, example prescribed may be different for occasion to Afro-American. Is that presented in a guideline interface? Again, yeah, so I think that would be something that you might include in the evidence to decision elements, or potentially the practical information, if that would be relevant. It's an app to process of research with a publication option. Basically, yes. So everything after you have your evidence content, you use MAGICapp for. So you create your evidence profiles here, you do your evidence to decision process. There's also a whole bunch of different things that you can do, like conflicts of interest management, and some additional features that I'm not going to get into, but there's ways that you can also do voting and some additional other things. But I just want to focus on kind of the more core features of MAGICapp, and then also some of the updating features, which I think are most relevant for living evidence and living guidelines. So the content I had previously. So I'm just pulling up, I've actually created the first version and the second version with the updated evidence, just to make sure that everything was working earlier. But I will take the original content that I had for the first Revamp file that I had with 2 studies of information and 2 outcomes. And then when I try to go to the original guideline, it actually tells me that there's a newer version. So in this particular case, I do actually want to see the older version. If I'm looking at the older version, I actually get an alert at the top here. So it says that it's out of date. But for me, I do actually want to see this content. So I kind of ignore that. So for benefits and harms, some of the content that I've added here is that compared to usual care, treatment A probably has little or no difference in all-cause mortality and may have little or no difference on self-reported clinical recovery. So I'm just going to copy in that content here. Certainty of the evidence, there is moderate certainty evidence for the all-cause mortality and then low certainty for the self-reported clinical recovery. For values and preferences, again, this is all kind of made up data, but I would say that mortality was a critical outcome, and then self-reported clinical recovery was an important outcome. And there's no difference in either of the outcomes really, but perhaps there may be somewhat of a signal for self-reported clinical recovery. So that might be of interest to some patients, which is why it's not a strong recommendation against. And then for recency and other considerations, I will say that treatment A is an inexpensive and widely available oral medication, and there's no considerable resource use issues. For the rationale, I have some template text here. That's like when moving from evidence to recommendations, the guideline development panel emphasized that there's a potentially small but important mortality increase from treatment A compared to usual care, although the difference between the treatment options was not statistically significant, and there may be a small increase in self-reported clinical recovery, so some patients may want to try treatment A. So that is the proposed rationale that I would include. And then you can publish. Wait, this is not. So because I do not, because this isn't an organization-owned guideline, I did not publish. I cannot publish because this is just a personal use one. So you can play around with it as much as you want, but you can't publish content unless you have a license. So I'm just changing the owner and now I have the option of publishing, and I will publish the new version. So let's say this is version 1. Let's say it's today's date for publishing and also for the evidence search. And then I will wait a couple minutes. Shouldn't take too long because it's a very small guideline. So I'll check the questions in the meantime. Okay, yes, I can share my email, no problem. Okay, here we go. Yasser asks, how can we integrate GradePro summary findings tables or ETB tables and use them to update them in the MAGICapp platform? Can we build other formats based on CG implementation tool? Yeah, great question. Yasser Amer, thank you so much. So with GradePro, we can pull some of the data because we include like similar content. But we don't like the way that our ETDs are structured, it doesn't translate. So you do have to unfortunately kind of copy and paste the content. It doesn't have like full seamless integration. And then when it comes to additional implementation tools, I think there's people that are trying to do different things with that. I don't know that much about the research in terms of clinical decision support. You'd have to ask my colleague, Dr. Stein-Vandeveld. But I can mention at least that we have like an open API. So all of the content is actually useful, you can use it in other ways. So I know that there's the WHO uses like a WHO Academy app. So it's like some kind of like sort of point of care decision aid, clinical practice guideline clearinghouse and also decision aids. And then they use our API. But I'm less certain about how that's done because I'm not that much of a tech person. But if you send me an email, I can definitely direct you to our CTO and also our clinical decision support people who would be more able to answer your question. And I'm just going to write my email here. And it should be published by now. So I'm just going to refresh the page. Okay, so now it's published. So now you can see that there's the version, the date that it's published, and then you can see that you can't edit the content because I'm looking at a published version of the content. So I can see what the recommendation is. I can look into the evidence profile. I can like see additional data. So if I click the little eyeball there, I can see sort of like the study data individually. And I can also see the reasons for downgrading if I want to. Again, this is kind of this multi-layered format concept where you can drill down and see additional information. And then also the decision aids, I can sort of quickly show you what I showed you earlier. And that's, you click it and then the data is automatically here. So usual care, treatment A, difference between the two. Super easy. I didn't have to do anything. And now to edit. So this is one of the newest things that we introduced. It's called shadow outcomes. And I will show you. So in this particular case, I have a fictional additional trial that was added as to a Revamp file. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create shadows from Revamp. So here it says upload your updated Revamp file. So I'm uploading version 2 of this. And then again, it's the same comparator that I'm interested in comparing. And I have an option here to, like, for example, if between your first version of your evidence profiles and then your second version, you may have changed one of your outcome names, but the content is still the same. You just have an option to fix the match. In this case, all of my outcome names are still exactly the same, so there's no issues. Everything matches perfectly. So I'm continuing on. Just going to check questions. Yes, I put the email in the chat box. Okay, so I have this lovely little note. Yeah, you did it. Okay. So now we have our shadow outcomes. So in this particular case, we had 2 studies with 3,328 participants. And now we have 3 studies and then 9,328 participants. And then as you can see, my relative risk has changed. My absolute effects have changed. And then it does not change your certainty rating. So you have to actually fix that manually. So in this particular case, my relative risk is now 1.2 and my confidence interval is 1.01 to 1.42. So actually, I'm not going to rate it down for imprecision anymore. So I go back into my grade evidence assessment. I say no serious. I remove the comment. I remove this part as well. I say yes. And now also my plain language summary doesn't make sense because I have high certainty evidence. So in this case, I delete this. I say that the comparator is favorable and I say high certainty. There's an important benefit harm. And then I say that treatment A increases all-cause mortality. And that is my new, that's my new outcome information. And then I decide if I want to accept it or delete it. And then if I want to accept it, it will replace what the original outcome information was. So now I only have the one all-cause mortality outcome. When it comes to the self-reported clinical recovery outcome, even though the data has changed, it hasn't really changed that much in the effect size or the confidence interval. So I'm actually going to leave all of my ratings the same. And I'm just going to accept it with the new numbers and the exact same certainty of the evidence and plain language summary. Okay, so now we have our updated evidence profile. And now that we have our updated evidence profile, we also want to update our recommendation. So in this case, what I had here was that there was little or no difference in all-cause mortality. And then that's one of the reasons that, or that's actually the main reason that I made it a weak recommendation against. But in this case, I actually think there's a reason to make it a strong recommendation against now, because there is this statistically significant effect on mortality and high certainty evidence. So I've already updated the content, so I'm just going to copy it over. But what I wrote here is the updated systematic review had a new trial with like 6,000 more participants and then showed increased mortality. So I'm going to add that content here now. Save that. And then for the certainty of the evidence, again, a slight change in that now there's high certainty evidence and there's no reason to grade down. Values and preferences, that also slightly changed. So mortality would be a critical outcome. And there's no difference, there's little or no difference on self-reported clinical recovery, but there's an increased risk of mortality. So now we decided that all or almost all patients would decline it, which is why it's a strong recommendation. And there's no change in the resources and other considerations, because again, it's widely available and there's no considerations. So that is my update for the evidence to decision. When it comes to the rationale, I have an update again because of the new evidence on mortality. So I just add in my comments here. So now it's like the strong recommendation against, and the panel emphasized the mortality increase. And there may be a small increase in self-reported recovery, but it was unlikely to result in patients favoring treatment A over usual care. So that is that. And the decision aid is already automatically updated with the new data. As you can see, 10 more. So no need to make any changes there. And that is my new evidence profile. And my strong recommendation would be, we recommend against this. And I will also have a little tag here. So there's a bunch of different things you can do for each recommendation, but I wanted to highlight that you can set a status label. So I'm going to set it to updated and a date. And then I can say, you know, I can create a comment here that would say, new evidence shows increased mortality risk, high certainty evidence. I set my status. And then in this case, I am ready to republish. Fairly straightforward again. I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to make a comment about the changes. So I'm going to say updated systematic review, conditional recommendation, treatment A changed to strong recommendation against. And I'm publishing a new version. Okay, so let's see if there's any additional questions. Okay, nothing that I'm seeing so far. I guess I can also show oh, there's a, okay. Should be published by now. Yes, because it's very small. So now I can look at the recommendation version history and I see there's a difference between the first and the second. There's an updated tag. There's some feedback that I can look at. If I want to keep the feedback internal as an administrator, I can actually select the option to hide it in the published versions. But in this particular case, it's just an example. It's internal. It's not made to the public. So I decided to keep the options there. And then I can also look at the version history of the whole guideline itself. So here is the version 1. I can view the version 1 again if I want to. Here's version 2. Here's my comment as to what changed between version 1 and version 2. And another thing is, like, in terms of the subscription option, to subscribe, you just need to have an account in MAGICapp, and then you just subscribe to the updates and then put your email here. And then if you're an administrator, you can see all the people that have subscribed. And then you can send message to your subscribers. And this is a thing that we're implementing in, I think, the next version of MAGICapp, is that your subscribers are not alerted every time you publish. They're only alerted if you tell them that you, like, if you say alert the subscribers that you published a new version. This is useful when, for example, if you kind of notice a typo or something and you have to republish something, you don't want to tell everyone that something's been published if it's like a super minor correction, for example. I think that's everything. I actually have quite a bit of time left. To kind of anticipated that we would do this together so that there would be some troubleshooting. But I'm more than happy to cover some other topics that people are interested in, maybe some other questions related to updating, anything about like versions, or any other questions related to living evidence synthesis. Okay, I see a question from Sami Mushta. Thank you. What is the difference between this platform and other platforms like Prospero and Revamp? Great question. So Prospero is a place where you can register systematic reviews, and Revamp is a place where you can create evidence syntheses. So this is kind of the next step. So for example, if you're going to do a systematic review, you would register it in Prospero, and then you would do your meta-analysis in Revamp, and then you would take your meta-analysis and input the data into MAGICapp, and then create your recommendations from that and publish. Okay, any other questions so far? Can we use the scoping review to synthesize the evidence? Great question. So that would require, I think my login timed out. I have to log back in. Here we go. In this case, that would definitely require using the narrative outcome. So for example, if we have something here, and we have like scoping review results, then we can add an outcome that is narrative. So let's say behavior change. And we can have maybe a detailed description here. So like if we want to be more specific by what that means, like change in behavior by patients, something like that. And then for the absolute effect estimates, instead of having, you know, all of the different boxes for data, you just have a narrative description. So let's say that you have, I don't know, whatever your results are, behavior change studies n equals 10 demonstrated the following themes XYZ. Obviously, I can't really come up with results on the fly, but I hope that at least it makes sense. And then you can still add references like where the data came from, for example, so that people can sort of, again, drill down to find where the results are coming from. You can still add certainty. We don't have CirQual capacity yet. We don't have a lot of people using CirQual and using the platform, so we haven't prioritized including it, but that is one of the things on our list of updates. And you can also include the plain language summary, but I guess you'd probably phrase it a little bit more differently, or you can just have your outcome and then your results. And then the other option is that you can include a summary of the evidence. So here you would have like a scoping review by Turabi et al. Oh gosh, sorry, my autocorrect. 2022 showed XYZ, something like that. And then that way you still have like the outcome linked to the recommendation, if that's something that you're interested in. If you're not interested in having something like that, you may opt for something more something like less structured than the evidence profile, for example, and then you can just have it as like a summary in the benefits and harms, for example, depending on what kind of data you have from the scoping review. So that's also an option. Thank you for the question. Oh, I'm sorry. Would have to answer the questions. Okay. Sorry. So the question was whether we can use a scoping review to synthesize the evidence. So that's the question that I just answered. And the previous question was the difference between Prospero, Revamp, and MAGICapp. And there's a new question. Do you include the discussion about the evidence after issuing in the platform? It depends if you mean the updated evidence or if you mean the evidence in general. So for both those things, yes. It really depends on what you're interested in showing to your users. A lot of times you have a sort of synthesis of the evidence in different ways. You may not necessarily have it as directly linked to the outcome itself. So I will show you an example with the therapeutics guideline, because they actually, a lot of organizations kind of use this model instead, where they have a sort of like whole entire section of the evidence. So for example, in this case, what triggered actually summary of the guideline. So it could be something like this. So it would be sort of like a narrative summary of, what are the new trials, like what does the evidence say? And it would be described more like this. In this case, they do have, the specific evidence profiles for each recommendation, but some organizations may not have the resources to do that, or may not have the evidence to do that with. So they may have more of a narrative summary as like its own section, for example. So you may have like a research evidence sort of section, and then you would have recommendations based on consensus, for example. So that would be another way to do it. There's a bunch of publicly accessible guidelines in MAGICapp if folks are interested in checking them out, because you will notice that different organizations use different models of synthesizing the evidence, presenting the evidence, doing the evidence to decision process. There's a lot of different examples. Okay, anything else? I don't think I'm missing any other questions. Okay. I'm not sure if there's anything else that folks would be interested in me covering. Okay. I think all the Q&As are gone now. They've already been answered. And I just wanted to ask the host if there's anything else that would be useful for users. Okay.
Okay, let's take this is the only last questions. After that, we're gonna take a break. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
What are the recommendations site to look for guidelines? So if you go to MAGICapp in general, then you will see all of the content. So I'm just going to log out of my account so that you can kind of see what you would see as a user. So it's just www.magicapp.org. I guess I can show you another guideline that might be interesting for folks. Maybe I can show you the Australian guideline. They're really doing an excellent job. So the content is all on the front page. You can search for particular organizations if you want to see content from them. You can sort it by, let's say that the name of the guideline or something like that. But generally, like all of the most recent recommendations are going to come up at the very top, and then the older ones are going to be lower down. So if you look at the Australian guidelines, they have published a lot. They were updating every week for the majority of the pandemic. They've slowed down their updating since, just because the volume of evidence is not the same anymore, but they're still updating quite frequently. And they've also published some methods papers on the way that they've done their guideline development and updating process. So as you can see, this is version 65, quite a lot. And if you look at even their version history, they do specify what changes have been in between. But there's, you're kind of scrolling and scrolling through so many versions, all the way back in 2020. And yeah, so as you can see, they have a different kind of model of doing things. So they might maybe specify some of the color coding. They have a website for their content in general, which is really well integrated with MAGICapp, but it has a lot of their own content there. I think there's a link to it here somewhere. But they had a huge collaborative effort in terms of the number of organizations that they work with. So that's why there's so much contextual and methods information. I think it's this. Yes, so here's an example of how people integrate MAGICapp content into their own website. So in this particular case, you have the latest guidance. So it tells you what time. It kind of links you to the individual recommendations. So if you click them, okay, in this case, actually, it's just like updates that are specific for them. But let's say if I want to go to a specific recommendation like this one, if I just click it from their drop-down list, might take a second to load because it's so big. But they have their living guidelines. They have like clinical flowcharts, topics under review. So like some content here, you can ask questions. You can submit questions to them that they answer. They take that feedback into account. They also are one of the only guidelines that have like an open commentary option. So I click the Molnupiravir button, and now I'm taking just to the Molnupiravir recommendation. So I don't have to kind of scroll through or use the search feature to find that particular recommendation. And then I also have this feedback button, which means I can actually, if I have a MAGICapp, if I have a MAGICapp account, I can sign in and leave a comment. And they actually sometimes like leave comments there with their feedback, for example. So they have this very transparent way of doing the updating process, and very collaborative and very involved with people, with different organizations in Australia and also the public. There's another question. Can you share your email? Okay. Yes, I'm happy to share my email. Just write it in again. And yeah, there's 9 minutes left, so I'm happy to just call it a day, give everyone a break. Thank you so much for your kind attention for the last 80 minutes or so. I really appreciate it. And I hope this was helpful. Feel free to contact me. I'm more than happy to talk living evidence all day. Definitely a huge passion of mine. And yeah, thank you so much.